Hello, I'm Nyree and I'm the Compliance Genie. I'm going to provide a bit more information around data protection because the 5 minutes in relation to the training the other day was just a really quick overview and quick tips in relation to data protection. Because it's quite a big area, I'm going to cover it in a bit more detail for everybody. So I'm going to cover understanding data protection requirements and what your responsibilities are. Let's see if I can get the screen to move. Okay, so we're going to cover what is data protection, who it applies to, and why it is important, and just to think about the associated risks, what you need to do, and also the support that is available to you guys, because you don't need to do this on your own. Okay, so what is data protection? So a lot of people will know it through GDPR. So GDPR was actually incorporated into the UK system by the Data Protection Act 2018. UK GDPR, since we left Europe, has now been referenced as UK GDPR. So you will see that in some places. So basically it protects people's personal information and it lays down the rules as to how this information can be used. Okay, so personal information is anything that can be used to identify somebody. Somebody is something such as a name, address, telephone number, photograph, IP address on the computers, email addresses, medical information as well. So anything that either can be used individually or in line with something else that can identify somebody. And it covers all the processing, all of of information, so it doesn't matter where people are located, it depends on where they're resident. So UK citizens' data has to be dealt with in the same way no matter where they are in the world. So the principles of data protection are it needs to be used fairly, lawfully, and transparently. Well, I'll explain a bit more what that means. Lawfully and transparently, basically individuals who are giving their information, you understand why you're giving it and what they're actually doing with it. So I can't say, right, please give me this information, I'm only going to use it for this, and then go and use it for something else. Okay, so it needs to be used for explicit purposes only, and it has to be used in a way that is adequate, relevant, and is limited where it's only necessary. It has to be kept accurate and up to date. Now, this is where it is no longer practical to keep information forever and a day, because the longer you keep it, the more likely it's to be out of date, which is actually going to be a breach of data protection requirements. And it also has to be handled in a way that ensures appropriate security. So you are responsible for any of the personal information that you're borrowing from other people. So this is the key thing about data protection. GDPR put the ownership back into individuals' hands. It's my data. I can decide where I want it to go to, and if I want it back, that's what I've got the rights to do that. Okay, so who does it apply to? Basically, it applies to any business entity that is processing personal information. So if you're self-employed, you're still covered by the requirements, or you're still caught by the requirements. If you're a sole trader, if you're a big company, if you're a small hairdresser, cake maker, it covers anybody who has got personal information. Now, you might not think you've got information, but if you've got a website with a contact us information on there, or just something that's collecting cookies, or you've got a list of clients that you send mails out to people every week or whenever, you've got personal information. So there's just a bit of, I've explained, sorry, what personal information is. So you could keep a copy of that, okay? It includes any collecting, storing, using and deleting data. And it also includes any data that you transfer into somebody else, which that's what's classified as processing. If you've got any staff, what you collect about them is different to your customers. And I think this is where a lot of people just think, well, we just need a privacy policy. But when you've got staff, you need to also explain what you're collecting about them, why you're collecting it, and obviously have provisions in place to make sure it's safeguarded and that it's deleted when you no longer need it. So why is it important? So I know there's a lot of information about potential fines, and there was the big scary fines. We can fine you up to so many millions of your turnovers. But it's the potential risk of the fine depends on what provisions you've put in place, and if you can actually evidence that you understand the requirements and you take them seriously. So other things that you need to consider of, and not just the fine, is your business reputation. So you want to protect your business from potential bad publicity. businesses generally be as an extension as you as a person. So, you know, generally you don't want to be seen that you're not taking people's personal information for granted and you're protecting it. At the end of the day, you're borrowing somebody's personal information, and just like anything else, if you were borrowing it, you'd expect to give it back or keep it safe while you've got it. It can result in complaints. So potentially if you're contacting somebody that you haven't got permission for, and fines. It also keeps ahead of enables you to keep ahead of the competition, because it actually makes your business, you can make your business a lot more streamlined when you understand where all the data is going, which is also business improvements. So you can implement efficiencies which will actually save you time and money, and you can actually make better decisions. So you can understand where you need to put security in place, where your highest risk data is, and also it enables you to scale with confidence. If you've got the right foundations in the beginning, you can build on that a lot easier than collecting all this information in a few years' time thinking, oh, what am I going to do with this? You know, and you've got to backtrack. It's very difficult to backtrack. It's always easier to start with a proper foundation. Individual protection. You as a business owner can demonstrate you're protecting customers' data, and it leads to improved customer confidence. And you're also protecting yourself as an individual. Under GDPR, there is an accountability requirement. So you've got to show that you're being accountable and you understand the requirements and you're actually implementing them to the best of your ability. You cannot, also it's business protection against fines. It can help you protect online business against cyber threats. There's this misunderstanding that, well, I've got some insurance for that. The insurance is unlikely to pay out if you haven't got the provisions in place. It's a bit like having house insurance and leaving the door open. You need to have the provisions in place for them to say, well, you've done the best of your ability, actually, now this is the last resort, we will pay out. So what do you actually need to do? You need to understand what data you have. So when I say data, it's personal information. So the first thing I would suggest you do is make a list of all the possible places that you have data. Your phone, laptops, pieces of paper everywhere, filing systems, in the cloud. Just make a list of everywhere that you've got information and document how you obtained it. Did the customer give you it directly? Did you get it from somebody else? And when did you actually get it? Because if you had it 10 years ago, do you know it's up to date? So you also need to understand why you're collecting it. And what I would say, you need to do all this before you actually do your privacy policy. So having a templated privacy policy will help you, but you still need to understand all this basis, because that privacy policy needs to be tailored to your business. So anybody who is checking the privacy policy knows what they do with what you do with their data, and not you just using a generic one from somebody else. Because at the end of the day, they've got to understand everything before they actually allow you to borrow that information. So you have to sort of understand where your data is and why you're collecting it. So there's actually 6 legal bases for why you can collect personal information. And if you haven't got a valid reason, you shouldn't be collecting it. So if you're collecting something because you're doing some business with somebody and there's an exchange of money or there's contract in place, your legal basis would be contractual. If you've got staff, again, it would be contractual, but actually there would be regulatory requirements for keeping that information because you've got to pay HMRC tax and things like that. So you need to understand the legal basis. So the 6 legal basis, one of them is consent. Consent it's not a difficult one, but it actually has to be managed, because you can't get consent and assume that it lasts forever. It's actually got to be refreshed, and it's got to be worded in a certain way. And another one people use is legitimate business interests, which is fine, but there's actually an assessment that you've got to do if you're going to use that, and that has to be reviewed on a regular basis. So one thing about compliance is make sure everything is documented, because then you can justify your decision or explain your decision, and it all goes to the accountability requirement to show that you understand what you need to do and you've undertaken it. So you also need to understand where the information is, who has actually got access to it, is it stored securely, and is it transferred securely if you transfer it to a third party? Now, a lot of misunderstanding that I see is, I use a third party mail system, something like MailChimp. Well, they're compliant, so I am. Well, the thing is, you're actually transferring personal information to them, and they're storing it, or they're a processor. So although the systems will be secure, you're actually required to check that you're happy with them And if somebody did, if you were using consent and someone reverts that consent, you're responsible for actually going to delete that data, because although they would take them out their subscribe lists, they're unlikely to delete the information, because you're sharing the information to allow you to do what you need to do, but you're the data controller, so you're responsible with the data that you've collected, and they're just the processor. So this misconception is that, well, actually, they're responsible. The good thing about data compliance, so GDPR actually made everybody compliant. It's a web of compliance, so I can't transfer my data to you unless I know you're compliant. So, you know, you also need to think about, if you're using a VA, where are them VAs located? Are they keeping your data secure? Because you're still responsible. You should have an agreement in place with any VAs, but if they were located outside of Europe or the UK, have they got the same provisions in place protecting that data? Because it would come back to you. So it's just to be aware of where your data is and who's got access to it. So in relation to your staff, if you've got different levels of systems of who gets access to what, depending on what type of data it is. And also to understand when to delete it. So this ties into your legal basis. Some legal bases, there's no right for an individual to get that information deleted. So for a regulatory basis, if you've got to keep that information and a customer says, please delete it, you can't, because you need it for a regulatory purpose. So this is why it's important to understand why you're collecting the information and you've got it all documented. And also, it needs to be reviewed regularly. Your business changes and evolves. You might decide to change your mailing system. You might decide to change your cloud storage. You might have new staff on board. So you need to regularly review it. Am I giving my data somewhere else? Because if you're regularly changing things, you need to update the privacy policy that you're providing to your customers. And anybody who has personal information that you hold, you have to provide them with an updated privacy policy. So it's all these things that you need to be aware of. So your privacy policy is provided when you first collect information. So remember that you're borrowing people's information, so you need to inform them what you're doing with it so they can make an informed decision. And the data should be used in line with your privacy policy. Now, individuals have certain rights in relation to the data that they're giving you, because obviously it's their data. They have the right to be informed of what you're doing with it, which is your privacy policy. The right to access. So if somebody says, tell me what information you hold about me, you have to provide that within a certain time frame. A right to deletion. They can say, please delete the information you hold about me. This ties into your legal basis, but you'd have to explain, if you can't delete it, why. You can't just ignore them and say, well, I'm not deleting it. A right to amendment. If you know that information is wrong, or they tell you it's wrong, you've got to change it to make sure it's correct. And a right to object. Okay, so a right to object is if you were using consent for marketing and someone says, please don't contact me again. They can say that. If you were using legitimate interest for a business reason and they say, please don't contact me, they've still got the right for you to not contact them. So you need to understand what needs to be done in the event of any of these cases where an individual actually says, I want to invoke my rights. You know, if they wanted to make a complaint, they're potentially going to use standard wording, which says, under GDPR, I would like to revert my rights, So you need to understand, or at least have a understanding of where you need to go for further support if this happens. Security. You need to ensure you've got appropriate provisions in place to protect the personal information you hold. So in relation to IT, make sure you've got the right antivirus. It's going to be updated on a regular basis. Can't remember what they're called when they do the updates in relation to the antivirus. Password protected. When you're emailing things to people, make sure the password protected. I do see a lot of people emailing personal information without any protection on whatsoever. Some of this stuff is quite sensitive, especially like if you're collecting medical information, there's extra provisions around that. So you need to be very aware of what you're, how you're transferring things. You also need to check that whether you need to be registered with ICO. I have found a lot of businesses don't think they need to be registered, even if they're self-employed. There's actually an assessment on the website. ICO, go through it, you tell them what they do, and they say, well, you should be registered or not. If you should be registered and you don't, there's a potential fine of £4,000. The fee, if you pay by direct debit, for most people, obviously it's more as the businesses get bigger, but for most people, it's £40, but £35 if you pay it by direct debit. Okay, if something goes wrong, so in the event of a significant breach, so you had a lot of personal information go missing or someone had access to it, and there was a lot of credit card information or a lot of medical information or sensitive information, then you may have to report it to the Information Commission Officer, which is ICO. So you need a system in place to make sure that you're notified of any breaches. So if you had a third party that was using your data or that was processing your data because you'd allowed them to do it for whatever reason that you needed them to do, if they had a breach, they needed to be telling you straight away so you can make a decision whether that needs to be notified to ICO or not, or the individuals. Okay, accountability. So you need to be able to evidence that you've considered and understood all the requirements. So if everything's documented on each process of each item of what I've said in the training before, then you're likely to be able to understand the accountability. And also your responsibility can't be outsourced. You can't assume because another company is compliant, whether you know that they are or not, because for most companies, if you're transferring the information, you need to do appropriate due diligence. But you're still responsible. You can't say, well, so-and-so did it. That's not my responsibility. You can protect yourself if you are actually sharing information on a regular basis with a different business and set up certain agreements, but you just need to be aware that you're responsible. So you need to do your utmost to make sure the personal information that you're collecting is protected appropriately. And also review your business, which is what we covered before. Because so in relation to marketing, I'm just going to move the little video here. In relation to marketing, you need to be careful. So although GDPR applies to marketing because they use the definition of consent in GDPR, it's actually the Privacy Electronic Communications Regulations, and it restricts unsolicited marketing. Now, DMs on social media and emails all covered under the same thing, and there's stricter rules for marketing to individuals. So you need consent that's like a particular consent to send unsolicited direct marketing, and it needs to be managed. So you can't get consent at outset, or you can't just say, promise I won't spam you, because that is not consent. You need to have consent. Individuals need to know how to revoke it, and you need to give them the ability to opt out. And if someone did revoke consent, then you need to make sure that they come off the mailing list and they're deleted within a certain period of time. If someone gives you consent, you've actually got to have provisions in place to refresh that consent, or do an assessment to think, well, actually they haven't opted out at this point, so I'm assuming the consent is okay. But you have to just be very careful with consent. Consent is classed as a gold-plated of legal basis. So if you give somebody consent and said, I'm going to process this information with your consent, and they removed it, you can't say, well, actually, I'll use this legal basis now, because it doesn't actually work that way. Once they've removed that consent, it's very hard to get the consent back again. So don't assume your email provider will cover your responsibilities in relation to consent. They have opt-out processes and how to reconsent people in there, but you have to understand the process, and also to make sure you have a system to refresh your consent on a regular basis and make sure it's still current. And make sure your privacy policy is appropriate, so people know who they're sharing the information with. Okay, just so they can make informed decisions in relation to their consent. So going through some certain particular examples, coaches, you'll definitely need a privacy policy. If you've got a website, if you're dealing with customers direct, you will need a privacy policy. Occasionally, you might be collecting sensitive information. As the coaching industry expands, there's a lot more focus on not health issues, like inner child work and things like that. A lot of that is quite sensitive information. So you have to be very careful with health information, because it's very sensitive. And also in relation to, if you're doing training sessions, how are you sharing that across your communities? And do individuals know that you're sharing that information? Or, it has to be very clear at outset, because some people wouldn't allow or wouldn't be happy to have their information to be shared that way. Sorry, I've just got cramp in my legs. Yeah, so this is why Zoom changed. When you've got training sessions, it'll come up, please confirm you're happy to be recorded. And if you don't want to be recorded, then don't put your video on. So just to be aware. And it's also likely that you'll need to register with ICO. So the best thing to do is just do the assessment, print the assessment out. If it says you don't need to be registered, keep that as evidence that you know, you've gone through the assessment. Health professionals, health professionals, you will definitely need a privacy policy. So remember, any medical information that you're keeping is sensitive. So not only do you need the legal basis of why you're collecting that, you also then need to check there's another like documentation that you need to do to say, well, actually, I need it for this purpose as well, because it's medical information. Sensitive information is any medical, anything in relation to someone's biometric data, sexual orientation, race, ethnic, and also religion, and also children's information is very sensitive as well. So just to be aware of that. If you're using photographs, I would suggest you would need consent. They might say it's fine, but actually verbal consent, how do you prove that? So just be careful when you're using photographs. Generally, you don't need to get your privacy policy signed, but if you're using consent, get it signed, get an audit trail, get an email saying, yeah, I'm happy for them to, for you to use it. Photographers, you'll definitely need a privacy policy, and ensure your contracts evidence who owns the photographs. You know, obviously someone's paying you for that, but just think about, are these people happy for you to use it on your marketing? Because you know, you can't deny, it's the easiest way to actually know who an individual is through the image. Now, the majority of people will be fine, but you might get some that are not. And also, if you're doing group settings, obviously you can't have contracts with everybody, but just to make them aware and say, well, you know, the chances are we're going to use these for marketing. So if you're not happy, please don't get involved with it, just so people understand and they've got the option to actually exercise their rights or not. Okay, just checking I've covered everything. So I'm hoping that wasn't too quick. It was a bit more in depth than the 5 minutes. There is a lot of support available, but the main piece of advice I can give you is make sure you can evidence your compliance. If you've made a decision that you don't think you need to register with a regulator, or you're going to collect this information and you're going to keep it so long, just evidence it. It doesn't have to be in like all singing, all dancing. You know, if you've just got a file on Dropbox and you can just keep evidence of copy things saying I'm using this for that, and I think that needs to be kept for that long. You know, as your business grows and evolves, you'll get more understanding around it. Depending on how much personal information you've got, it also depends on the biggest risk. You know, when you're starting out, and a lot of it is people that you know personally, but just protect yourself, because in the long run, you don't know how anybody is going to react. You know, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So make sure you can evidence the compliance with the regulations. And if you have something foundational in place, you can build on that moving forward. So there is a lot of information available on the ICO website. So the link's there. If you just go in and just say for organizations and small SME hub, it'll show you everything, and there's little assessments that you can do, and it'll also tell you if there's a legal business assessment. It'll tell you if you've got any potential areas that you need to think of. So the easiest way is just to look at them. If you wanted to do it yourself, just to look at them and look at the highlights available and the ones that are showing you that there's potential issues, and then address those. Obviously, I can help support you depending on how much support you want and how confident you are in it, because it does appear overwhelming. Luckily, it's something I enjoy doing, but I appreciate that compliance isn't everybody else's cup of tea. So I have got a checklist that you can quickly go through, and it'll see what areas that you might potentially need to look at in relation to data protection. So you can go in a quick checklist and it'll tell you if you're compliant or whether you need to address certain things. And you could actually do that every year to say, right, has anything changed? Have I done this? There's a privacy policy template and a checklist, so you can check if your privacy policy is actually appropriate. The services I offer are the templated, tailored documentation, and actually full implementation, depending on how big a risk you deem it as a business, because at the end of the day, although the regulations apply to everyone, how you implement it depends on your attitude to risk in the business. Do you want full implementation and make sure no stones unturned? Do you want to do it yourself and do it the best of your ability. Everyone is different. Some people want to know all the regulations. Some people just want to take all the stress away from them and say, well, actually, it's not. That's a bit OTT, and I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. So yeah, or you can check out the website. Obviously, like I said, the support's available. If there's any questions that I haven't covered and you need a bit more, what's the word? If you need any more explanation around them, then you can always drop me a message. I'm on my website's My Compliance Genie. Social handles are at Compliance Genie, or you just send me an email at wishes@compliancegenie. I hope that has been very helpful.